So it's been a little bit of time since we discussed George Groves on this channel, so I wanted to do a George Groves special. So last time we discussed George Groves was when he took out the hopeless Andrea De Luisa in a decent performance, admittedly decent, against a well overmatched opponent. The week before that fight, I did a video saying George Groves is destroying his career through his personal arrogance and his inability to take any criticism and personal accountability for his failures in the sport. Instead blaming it on others, such as Paddy Fitzpatrick. For me, the George Groves deficiencies in his game were obvious. Number one, stamina, and number two, just a sort of tactical ineptitude. Fighting the wrong fights at the wrong times. Possibly punch resistance as well, that I suggested was due to being too tight at the weight. But regardless, he came out, he put a beating on Andrea De Luisa, and although it wasn't the sort of vintage, explosive George Groves that people hoped for, it was a solid enough performance. As I say, the opponent was well overmatched. Well, the news is out now that George Groves will fight on the Anthony Joshua Charles Martin undercard, I believe, against David Brophy. Brophy, for those of you who don't know, Boxrec have him as the 10th best super middleweight in the country. He's unbeaten. I think he's 16-0 with one draw. He's known, I've seen little bits of him. He's not someone whose career I've followed, not going to lie, but I have seen little bits of him. I know he beat Tobias Webb, for example. I guess he's known in boxing as quite a capable boxer, a very, very light puncher. I believe he's got a 6% knockout ratio, which kind of tells you all you need to know in terms of his punching power. But the guy is a relatively smart performer in that sense. He doesn't have too much of an amateur pedigree, but he certainly has decent boxing fundamental skills. I think he's trained by Billy Nelson. He's a relatively sharp boxer. You see him punching to the body well, and there are some strings to his bow. He looks to me like a guy who could get to a certain level in the game, maybe English champion, maybe on a good day even British champion. But for me, he's relatively ABC. There isn't like too much of an X factor in his game. Sometimes you watch a boxer and they are a pure boxer, but you could just see that there's so much class and so much elite X factor type skills that they have the potential to bridge the gap from British level to world level. A good example of that would be Billy Joe Saunders. When I was looking at Billy Joe Saunders, he wasn't knocking people out. He was relying very much on boxing fundamentals. He was doing the basics well. But you just kind of got the sense there was a big step up available for him. With David Brophy, I don't necessarily get that same feeling. Just based on the eye test alone, which may be an unfair thing to go on, I kind of get the sense he's more of an English level type guy. I'm trying to think of a different example. I don't know if anyone's seen the Frank Warren prospect, Tom Baker. He's another guy I look at, Baker, and Baker, he does the fundamentals really well. He's got a good jab. He's very ABC. Sticks to a game plan, and he's real solid. But there just isn't much there to look at that makes you think, oh, this guy's going to go on to be a world champion. And that's kind of the feeling I have when I look at David Brophy. And don't get me wrong, this is a good fight for Brophy to take. George Groves does have flaws in his game. He really does. We know about his stamina. We know about his punch resistance. We know about his questionable tactics at times during fights. And if Brophy can put a win on George Groves, then Brophy puts himself in a mix to fight James DeGale, puts himself in a mix to fight Callum Smith. He puts himself in the mix to get some real big paydays. So for David Brophy, it's a very sensible fight to make. If he loses, it's not going to be a devastating loss for him. Assuming he doesn't get knocked out horribly. He's a fighter who isn't expected to beat George Groves, I presume, and his profile will be raised. He's going to be fighting on a massive platform. Probably he'll be featuring in the co-main event of a pay-per-view that does, 6, 7, 800,000 buys. So, fair play to David Brophy. From George Groves' perspective, it's not the best fight he could have taken. He could have fought someone more dangerous. I imagine they've looked at Brophy's knockout ratio and thought that that might be a good prep fight for George Groves, because we know George Groves doesn't like taking a big shot on the whiskers, and David Brophy probably doesn't seem to be that concussive knockout puncher. I mean, I would rather see George Groves against a domestic opponent like Brophy than an international opponent like Andrea De Luisa. So I think it's a better fight in that sense. But realistically, this is about keeping George Groves busy, isn't it? He's obviously going to have a bigger fight in the summer, most likely against Martin Murray from rumours. That's a fight that I'm not overly excited for, and I get a sense amongst the British public that they're not overly excited for it either. Martin Murray's a nice guy, very likeable, but who has Martin Murray actually beaten in his career? Who are the top 3 names Martin Murray has actually beaten? So many people talk about Martin Murray being world class, and he has got some skills. He does some things well. He's very tough, very durable. He can box a little bit, but is he really world class? I mean, how many world class fighters has he beaten? We know he's a guy whose reputation is coming up short in very, very spirited defeats. So, I personally am not that excited for Martin Murray, George Groves. I know the trendy thing at present, which I have participated myself in, is to hate on George Groves a bit. But I don't see Martin Murray beating George Groves. I think Martin Murray doesn't really have the offensive skill to beat George Groves. Murray's defensively sound, he's tough, he's durable, he's fit, he's got a good jab. Is he really going to have eye-catching enough offence to outpoint George Groves to win 7 of the 12 rounds? I don't personally think so. And Martin Murray's another guy who doesn't really carry proper punching power, so he's probably not going to knock out George Groves either. So it's a difficult one. Martin Murray won multiple rounds of Arthur Abraham, but that's because Arthur Abraham hardly threw a punch in those rounds. George Groves is a different test, and I think George Groves is just offensively in a different league to Martin Murray, and I expect him to be the more eye-catching puncher, the harder puncher, and winning the rounds. But anyway, I'm digressing. This fight he's got to get through first, David Brophy, and in many ways it's a similar type opponent to Martin Murray, I guess you could say. Boxer, fairly ABC, not a big puncher, and Groves is going to have to maybe go some rounds, go deep into the fight, but fundamentally I don't think Brophy's going to cause him too much trouble. And I think that, midway through the year, George Groves will have probably recorded wins over Andrea De Luisa, David Brophy and Martin Murray, which would put him very, very much back in the mix again. I've always said, I haven't always said actually, let me rephrase that. Recently I've said I don't see Groves necessarily having the success at £168 at world level because of his inability to address the issues with his game. He's very much a fighter who doesn't seem to like working on areas that he needs to improve on. He likes to stick with what he knows, and I do think that's going to be a real big issue for him throughout his career. But I don't see Brophy or Martin Murray, being the kind of fighter to really beat George Groves due to their lack of eye-catching and powerful offence. Just shifting gears very slightly, George Groves has also done an article this week where he says that he'd like to fight in the UFC. Now, when Tyson Fury did that, and as you guys know, I'm a Tyson Fury fan, but Tyson Fury was clearly joking. He was trying to steal a few headlines by calling out the UFC heavyweight champion at the time. George Groves, you got the impression he was actually serious about doing it. Now, I just watched the video on Hatman's channel. I'm a massive, massive fan of Hatman's channel. It's definitely one of the best boxing channels on YouTube. So shout out to him, definitely. And he was saying that George Groves has a fairly extensive kickboxing background, which I did know about, and also trains in jiu-jitsu, which I didn't know about. So, fair play to George Groves if he's got those skills in his locker. But what I would say is George Groves really, really, really needs to focus on his boxing, because he's not, at this point, a master boxer who has achieved all he can in the sport and needs to focus on other things to keep himself busy. I mean, George Groves needs to work on his fundamentals. He needs to work on making weight. He needs to work on his stamina. He needs to work on his defence. Those are the things he needs to be focusing on, not becoming a UFC fighter and fighting Conor McGregor, let me tell you. I mean, we've seen this before with George Groves, him trying to be a promoter, him trying to be a manager, him trying to be a businessman, and having too much sort of interest on other things outside of the ring. It's okay to do that if you're Floyd Mayweather and you're battering everyone within sight and no one can live with you in a boxing ring. But it's not okay to do that if you're, you know, going life and death with Dennis Douglin. You know, I just feel that George Groves is not blinkered enough, not focused enough on the sport of boxing, and he's got too many other interests outside of it. So, yeah, this UFC thing I think is largely ridiculous. I mean, I'm sure George Groves is a capable kickboxer. I'm sure he's trained in jiu-jitsu, but the guy's in his mid to late 20s now. He's not going to be able to compete at the same level in UFC as he is in boxing, I don't think, personally. And I just feel that he'd be better off focusing on a sport that he does actually have some talent in, and stop messing around trying to manage fighters, stop messing around with your jiu-jitsu, and actually acknowledge the areas of problem in your game rather than blaming others. And anyway, it's a bit of a rant, but there we are. David Brophy next time up. Let me know your thoughts on David Brophy, guys. As I say, I've seen little bits of him, but you know, I'm not going to pretend I've watched his back catalogue, and I'm often saying that at the minute. So if you've seen bits of him, let me know your thoughts. How do you rate him? Does anyone out there think he can give George Groves trouble? While we're at it, what about people's views on the Martin Murray fight? I'm not overly buzzing for that. I don't see it as a competitive fight. How do you see it? Many thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up, support the channel. Please press subscribe so you can follow my other videos. Many thanks for watching, guys.